Hey everyone, Nigel and Luke here, and welcome to Crime Zone. As you may or may not be aware, Luke and I are taking a much-needed vacation this week. Unfortunately, that means we aren't doing our usual Thursday triple upload that most of you are accustomed to. However, instead of just going dark for a week, we figured it would be better to at least cover one new case, so you all still have something to watch while we're away. If you're bummed out by that news, don't worry, we promise we'll be back to our regular schedule next week. Speaking of vacations, we decided it was only fitting that we choose a case to match the theme of the week. So today, our story will be taking us to the pristine, idyllic island beaches of the Gulf of Thailand. More specifically, to the island of Koh Tao. Koh Tao is the smallest of the three major tourist islands in the Gulf, attracting just a small percentage of the roughly 25 million foreign visitors that travel to Thailand each year. The population consists of just a few thousand native Thais, as well as a few thousand more migrant workers from neighboring Myanmar. Despite not being as large as its sister islands of Koh Samui and Koh Phangan, the former of which houses an international airport and the latter of which is famous for its full moon beach parties, Koh Tao has managed to gain a reputation in its own right over the years, primarily for its scuba diving and snorkeling. Though for many, the allure is still the island's party atmosphere, particularly on the popular resort-lined Siree Beach. Like many places blessed with such overwhelming natural beauty, there is also a darker side to the island. With the party atmosphere and tourism dollars comes the drug trade, as well as organized crime. Muggings and petty theft targeting visitors are also a daily reality, though not at all unique in these kinds of exotic locales. However, in the latter half of 2014, the island would be thrown into turmoil by a crime that was truly shocking. On the morning of September 15th, 2014, the lifeless, semi-nude bodies of a young man and woman were found by a beach cleaner on Siree Beach. Both had been brutally beaten and were found just meters apart from one another. The man had died from a combination of injuries to his head as well as drowning. The woman had died from similar blows to her face and had also been sexually assaulted. Blood-stained clothes were found near the bodies, as well as the suspected murder weapons, a similarly blood-covered garden hoe and a wooden club. The two victims were quickly identified as British students who had both arrived on Koh Tao at the end of August. The woman was 23-year-old Hannah Witheridge, a graduate student from the English village of Hemsby, who had been working towards her master's degree in speech and language therapy. The man was 24-year-old David Miller, a civil and structural engineering graduate from Jersey in the Channel Islands. Hannah and David had traveled to Koh Tao separately at the end of August, but had met after they both ended up staying at the Ocean View Bungalows, a small complex popular with backpackers located steps away from Siree Beach. Hannah had been traveling with 3 friends and David with 2. They had last been seen by friends in the early morning hours of September 15th, after both had gone to a party at a local bar attended mostly by foreign tourists. They had left together at around 1 a.m., and just a few hours later, they had been murdered. Almost immediately, it became clear that there would be one major force guiding the subsequent investigation into the killings: the desire to protect Thailand's vital tourism industry at all costs. Fearing that the murders could have a serious impact on the number of travelers to the country, national leaders placed enormous pressure on the police to resolve the situation in record time. This also meant shifting the blame as far away from the country itself as possible, even as investigators had barely scratched the surface of the case. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, police placed almost all of their focus on those who had been traveling with Hannah and David, as well as Koh Tao's population of migrant workers, while ignoring the native population. A police spokesman justified the seemingly glaring oversight by saying, quote, "Thais wouldn't do this." Outside of this problem, the initial investigation didn't fare much better. Though it was announced that ferry checkpoints had been set up to prevent people from leaving the island, a potential person of interest had already managed to leave. The man's name was Christopher Allen Ware, one of the people who had been staying with David Miller at the Ocean View Bungalows. This led to a flurry of salacious reporting for a couple of days, in which media speculated about Ware's bisexuality, theorizing that the case was a crime of passion brought on by jealousy after Miller left the bar with Hannah instead of him. However, Ware was tracked down at an airport in Bangkok 2 days after the murders and was dropped as a suspect shortly thereafter. Because of the 2 different murder weapons, police concluded that 2 perpetrators were involved in the crime, and Ware's brother James, the most likely person to serve as an accomplice if Ware was indeed guilty, had left Koh Tao before the killings had even taken place. Police would also later say that Ware was cleared by DNA evidence. With Ware out of the picture, Thai police once again turned their attention to the local Burmese migrant population, conducting DNA tests on at least 200 people, as well as interviews with countless others. Many of these people would later claim that they had received brutal treatment at the hands of police during questioning, including being scalded with hot water and threatened. It would be far from the last time allegations like these would surface during the investigation. CCTV footage was also collected from numerous restaurants and places around the murder scene, though police said that many of the cameras in the area had not been functioning at the time. The footage that did seem to exist had gaps in its coverage, and it would later be alleged that Thai police simply failed to request footage from many places that might have captured useful evidence, including a nearby pier where it may have been possible to escape by boat. Suddenly, after more than 2 weeks of constantly changing their narrative about who was behind the brutal crimes, Thai police announced that they had arrested 2 Burmese migrant workers for the murders, 2 22-year-olds named Zaw Lin and Wai Phyo. As a side note, Wai Phyo's name is also sometimes reported as Win Zaw Tun. Not only had the men confessed, but they had apparently been linked to the crime by DNA evidence. A shocking and highly unorthodox public reenactment of the killings followed the arrests, in which Zaw and Wai acted out what they had allegedly done for the media and prayed for forgiveness. Though Thailand apparently does not have jury trials, the bizarre reenactment would soon widely be condemned as being highly prejudicial to the men's subsequent trial. Despite this, for a brief moment, it appeared as if the case was closed. The men had admitted to drinking on the beach of the night of the murders, and furthermore, had allegedly confessed to police that the crime had been sexually motivated. Police also claimed that they had found David Miller's phone at Zaw's home. Unfortunately, it didn't take long for things to become far more complicated. For starters, Zaw and Wai had no prior criminal records, and as soon as they were allowed to speak to a consular representative from their home country of Myanmar, they recanted their confessions. They claimed that the confessions had been coerced, and that they had been subjected to horrifying treatment during their interrogation. This included being beaten by police, being left nude in a freezing room, and being threatened with electrocution. Police also suggested that the men might be extrajudicially killed if they did not confess. The interrogations had also been conducted with the help of a single interpreter, who was actually just a Burmese food stall vendor living on the island. The rest of the supposedly ironclad evidence that Thai police claimed they had soon faced similar scrutiny, with the DNA evidence in particular becoming a pivotal point of controversy. While police claimed that they had collected several samples for testing from Hannah's body, the murder weapons, and from nearby cigarette butts, media from within the country and elsewhere reported that the crime scene had been poorly secured. Officials were said to be inexperienced and did not know how to properly process the scene, allowing tourists, journalists, and others to walk through the area for days after the murders had taken place. The claim that David's cell phone had been found in Zaw's home likewise seemed suspicious, as prior to this, police had also said that it had been given to them by a friend of David's. Nonetheless, Zaw and Wai were put on trial for the murders of David Miller and Hannah Witheridge in July of 2015. The trial would last 18 days, spread out over several weeks, and would expose even more glaring problems with the police investigation. However, for a variety of reasons, both having to do with the country's judicial system and the men's defense team itself, at the end, Zaw and Wai would both be found guilty. First, Zaw and Wai's defense team was denied extra time to prepare for the trial, despite only being allowed to briefly meet with their clients before the proceedings began. The 900-page police report prepared by Thai authorities was also not provided to the defense team until the trial started. The report itself was riddled with contradictory and shoddily compiled information. Key pieces of evidence, such as the forms showing the original DNA analysis, were improperly dated, and allegedly even included handwritten notes and portions that had been crossed out. This was apparently such a problem that before the trial, even the prosecutors publicly rejected the report, calling for information to be corrected and for the entire thing to be made more succinct. In addition, many potential witnesses who might have otherwise been able to provide Zaw and Y with an alibi or come forward with additional information refused to do so, fearing retribution from the country's authorities. This was especially true of people from the Burmese migrant community, who were already particularly vulnerable due to the fact that most were in the country illegally. On July 10th, it seemed like the defense had won a small victory when the court ordered that the DNA evidence in the case be retested. By this point, the issues with possible contamination had been widely reported, and even the country's own chief of forensics, who had not been allowed to take part in the initial investigation, had criticized its collection and analysis. It was soon revealed that key samples had been used up during the initial testing, specifically the DNA evidence that had been taken from Hannah and David's bodies. DNA samples were available from the murder weapons that Thai police said still connected Zaw and Y to the crime, but when the country's chief of forensics was allowed to conduct testing himself, he claimed that the DNA did not match the suspects. At least one witness also claimed the weapons had been washed after they had been collected. Compounding these issues further, the defense team consulted with renowned Australian forensic scientist Jane Topin, who was highly suspicious of the timeline that Thai police had provided for their initial DNA extraction and analysis. Though the DNA samples that were collected were a mixture between the victims and the two suspects, Thai police claimed that they had managed to isolate and analyze the samples in less than 12 hours. Topin advised the defense team that this was highly unusual for a complicated analysis of this nature, and it was suspicious that testing had been completed so quickly. As mentioned before, several of the forms for these tests were also improperly dated and contained portions that had been rewritten, so I think we can safely say that the implication from Topin is that the tests were either incorrectly done or were totally bogus. Considering all of the issues with what should have been the strongest part of the case against Zaw and Y, it seemed like the defense team would have no problem dismantling the prosecution's case. However, it was here that they made two extremely bizarre choices. For starters, Jane Topin was not asked by the defense team to testify at the trial, even though she insisted she could be instrumental in helping to shed light on the problems with the DNA analysis conducted by Thai police. While there is no definitive reason why the defense team did not want Topin to testify, it has been speculated that they may have believed that testimony from a foreign expert would have biased the judges in the case against their clients. Secondly, it was reported that the defense team only chose to attack the DNA evidence in the case in their closing statement, lumping it in with a bunch of other information rather than systematically presenting the problems with the evidence throughout the course of the trial. The prosecution, on the other hand, made their version of the DNA evidence a central point of their case, something that turned out to be the major deciding factor for the three presiding judges. In late December of 2015, Zaw and Y were found guilty of murdering David Miller, as well as murdering and sexually assaulting Hannah Witheridge. Both men were sentenced to death. Subsequent appeals in the case in 2016 and 2017 failed, and in 2019, the case was settled once and for all when the Supreme Court of Thailand decided to uphold the sentence. In their ruling, the Supreme Court pushed back on notions that the case had been mishandled by police, saying that the evidence against Zaw and Y was, quote, clear, credible, and detailed. Though the men's death sentences were commuted to life in August of 2020 in commemoration of the Thai king's birthday and as a sign of his clemency, this did little to quell the reaction from the international community, many of whom pointed out that Burmese migrants were scapegoated for the crime from the very beginning. A notable opinion piece in the Bangkok Post even stated that, quote, practically no one actually believes that Zaw and Y really brutally murdered the English tourists. There were widespread protests in Myanmar after the guilty verdict, and human rights organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the International Commission of Jurists called for an independent and transparent investigation into the numerous allegations against Thailand's police force. Scathing reports and opinion pieces were released about the case, particularly in the British tabloids, who began to refer to Koh Tao as Death Island. The bad publicity seems to have amounted to very little, however, as Zaw and Y remain incarcerated. Though visitor numbers were down slightly in the months after the murders, there seems to have been no long-term effects to Thailand's tourism industry. So if Zaw and Y really aren't to blame for the murders, the obvious question remains: who is? Though there are numerous theories about who could have murdered Hannah Witheridge and David Miller, unfortunately, we can do little more than speculate. The most common rumor about the murders is that they have something to do with organized crime on Koh Tao, and that whoever is responsible either belongs to one of these criminal organizations, or at the very least, someone from one of these criminal organizations knows who is responsible. This theory emerged early on following the murders, and became a significant point of interest after a 25-year-old Scottish busker named Sean McKenna posted on Facebook that he knew information about who had committed the crimes. McKenna claimed in his post that local gangsters wanted him dead, and subsequently fled Koh Tao after he said that he had received numerous death threats and had been cornered in a local convenience store by gang members. Police briefly considered McKenna a suspect in the case, but escorted him to a ferry after his public pleas for help so that he could leave the island. Though McKenna pointed the finger at local organized crime, it appears as though he didn't actually know any specific information beyond that, as we could find no follow-up reporting about him. Another major theory in the case is that the perpetrator or perpetrators belong to a powerful or well-connected family in Thailand, and that police simply covered up the crime. In the mess of early accusations from Thai police at the beginning of their investigation, we found one report that said that someone from a powerful family on Koh Tao had been considered a suspect, but that the police commander who relayed this information was subsequently transferred, and the family was never spoken about again. Perhaps the truth lies in some mixture of these two prominent theories, or maybe it lies somewhere else entirely. The frustrating thing is that we just don't know. Finally, we should also note that there are some reports that mention an image of what appears to be a man of Asian descent who was captured on CCTV walking away from the bar sometime after David and Hannah were seen leaving on the night of their murders. It was reported at the time that police were seeking to identify this man, though we could not find any subsequent reporting that detailed whether his identity had ever been confirmed. There are also reports that David and Hannah may have gotten into an altercation with someone at the bar that night, and that Hannah may have been accosted by some unknown men the night before her death. Again, due to how quickly the narrative shifted once Thai police began their investigation, it is difficult to establish the validity of any of these reports, or if these people are even relevant to the investigation. Given the theories about the involvement of organized crime or powerful families on Koh Tao, though, perhaps this is by design. Regardless of how you feel about the case, it's clear that there are lingering mysteries that still desperately need to be solved here, especially if two men really are sitting in jail for terrible crimes that they did not commit. Whether an honest reanalysis of the facts of the case, as well as of the investigation itself, will happen anytime soon, though, is anyone's guess. That brings us to the end of today's story. What are your thoughts about the Koh Tao murders? Be sure to let us know in the comment section below. And if you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this, making sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest releases. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week when we get back from vacation.